welcome to the Parenting Show. I'm Jennifer Anderson. With me, my co-host, family counselor, and parenting expert, Alyson Schafer. We're talking about a new perspective on ADHD today. And of course, you know, many folks at home know what ADHD is, but let's talk about that new perspective.
So I really hope that people will stay and listen to the whole show. So I don't want to disenfranchise anybody right from the get-go. But what I would like to do is to discuss that maybe there is a different way of conceptualizing what is happening with kids who meet the criteria for ADHD. And notice my language. I'm quite happy to say when someone comes to my office in my family counseling practice or a meeting in an education setting with a teacher, I can say, yes, this child meets the criteria for attention deficit disorder as laid out in what's called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, which is what is the book that you need to refer to meet a clinical diagnosis, such that an insurance provider can then say, yes, that's the diagnosis, therefore this person has access to these benefits or these medications or whatever. But the problem is it's so easy to go down the path of pathologizing and saying somehow my child is disordered.
Right.
So my problem with the ADHD thing is there's a child who displays behaviors. So if I was going to do this, I am displaying behaviors. And you might say, yeah, you're like trying to do the Macarena, which I'm probably doing really badly, whatever. Children do display behaviors, and they fall into a pattern that, you know, because really the diagnostic, and I actually brought it. Okay. You actually go to the DSM, and you can do it online, and it will say the child, like, you know, fails to give close attention to details and makes careless mistakes at homework.
Right.
Lots of people don't pay attention to details.
Yes.
You know, I mean, there's like Myers-Briggs indicators that talk about personality types that say, like, are you an attention detailed person or are you more broad? So there's many ways to describe the why beneath that behavior. You know, does not listen when spoken to directly. I know all kinds of kids who do not listen to adults. So these are a list of behaviors, and if you have enough of them over enough time, then people will say you have ADHD as if you are disordered.
Right.
And so we add this layer of pathology, and the parent's mind goes to, well, if it's a diagnosis, if it's a psychopathology, they must somehow be deficient or broken in some way. And this label kind of sticks, and the construct of what's wrong with the child now gets locked into something that is biological. Now, all of our brains, if we put them under MRIs and different scans, for sure our brains show differences. But what we know is that the brain is actually incredibly plastic. There's something called neuroplasticity that we can shape the brain. Experience shapes the brain, and our brain could also shape our experience. So perhaps there's another story behind why children might display these types of behaviors. And if I told you any one of them, and you know, over the years that we've done this show, we've talked about kids who don't listen. You know, we've talked about kids who won't stay in their seat and get up and down and get up and down. But if you get the same kid who doesn't listen, gets up and up, down, somebody who has a temperament where they are an excitement seeker or have high energy, and that all those things fall on the same kid, suddenly we've got a label that they have a psychopathology.
Right. So I don't want to diminish any diagnosis, but
No.
is it comparable to, and can you relate it to somebody who self-diagnoses, you know, you go onto the internet because you have a list of symptoms that are somewhat generic, and suddenly you are dying.
So, yeah.
Right? Instead of just, you know, this. Does it make sense for parents to really delve into and have a professional diagnose? Or is it the idea of looking at some of the symptoms and saying perhaps they are happening because of something else?
Well, I want to give them the something else answer.
Okay.
All right.
So that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I want to be able to give a different reason why kids might meet the criteria for ADHD.
Okay.
And so one of the concepts in Adlerian psychology, which is the basis for this show and my parenting training, is the idea that we want to develop a child's what he called social interest. And social interest is innate in all human beings. It is because we're group creatures. We live in collective units. We live in families. We're social by nature. Social interest is that hard wiring in us that wants us to actually connect and care for the people around us. You know, we could call it empathy, call it compassion, the giving to others. So it is the natural way that human beings are supposed to grow and develop is to get kids to start caring for their fellow man from the earliest of age, which would mean things like, I live in a group, everything can't be about me. I live in a group, so not only do I get to talk sometimes, but you get to talk sometimes. I live in a group and I don't like fish, but I live in a group, so I don't get to have chicken fingers and French fries every night. Sometimes I have to eat what other people eat. These are missing experiences to a lot of children in our current North American culture, that kids do not learn to join the collective of the family. We do not develop their social interest or train them for cooperation. And instead they come in and they start to get a sense that they're the center of the universe, that they are entitled over other people, and they are not trained. And so they have very low frustration tolerance because they're so used to, I get what I want when I want it. That's how it's happened for the first 5 years of my life. I get up and down from the table because I don't actually care about table manners. I don't care if I'm interrupting your meal. I see a toy over there and I want to go get the toy. I'm going to get it. I'm going to bring it back to the table. I don't like this meal. I'm not going to eat it. I'm going to run around. You're going to chase me with a spoon. And you might get away with all of that for a while at home. But by the time you get to school, and this is where you're going to start seeing the ADHD diagnosis start coming down. Kindergarten, grade 1, mostly grade 1. Most diagnosis, it's usually the teacher at the door saying, I'm a little concerned about your child. Have you thought about? Have you talked to your doctor about? And the teacher's really saying, I'm seeing a kid who bugs their neighbor, gets up and down out of their desk, doesn't focus on what I'm teaching. And she's saying that meets the criteria for attention deficit disorder. And it does. It does meet the criteria. It also meets the criteria for somebody who has not been trained properly in social interest, that they have been pampered, indulged, they're entitled, and they have not had to constrain themselves and build up their frustration tolerance.
I think a light bulb just went off for a lot of people.
I hope so. I hope so. So here's where now when we start to say, oh, if this is a child who's not had the proper training, then we say, great, that gives me a different story about what the underlying problem is. That gives me something different to do as a parent or a teacher to work with this child to develop that capacity. What ends up happening is they end up getting the label of attention deficit disorder. They think their child, because of this pathology, is incapable. And rather than helping train them to sit at their desk, they go, well, he can't sit at his desk because he has ADHD. And then we go even farther down a rabbit hole because now we're not doing exactly what is needed to improve matters. And what we end up doing is medicating them, which will, you know, sedate them. And it can help focus the way other stimulants can. You know, there's other ways to be stimulated and control your focus. I mean, mindfulness meditation for one. So if you change the story about what the underlying issue is, then it changes the story about what you're going to do about it, and it gives you, I feel, incredible optimism to say this is not like a life curse. This is something you can live with, work with, you know, function well with, improve over time.
And you're not discounting medication because medication has its place.
Yeah, and for sure. And there are kids based on different things going on, like for example with the impulsivity or whatever. I mean, if you have brain injuries to a certain part of your brain, absolutely, that's going to impact some of those executive functioning things and everything else. But to jump to the conclusion that every kid that fidgets in grade 1 and who doesn't listen, who can't stay on task, meets the criteria for ADHD and then gets whacked on some, you know, Adderall, that really breaks my heart. I really think that's a shame. So are there some kids that have some issues and that's going to be a good path? Absolutely. I don't want those people to think that I'm discrediting what's going on in their family. It's an individual thing. But this other larger story needs to be told.
Right. We've reached out to people on social media to ask them if they have questions about the topics of each of our parenting shows. We do have a couple. This one kind of speaks to what you're talking about. I arrive in... So this one is my 11-year-old daughter was diagnosed with ADHD since an early age. So we as parents are fairly seasoned at living with the challenges this type of learning disability entails. However, there is one aspect of our relationship with her that still puzzles me, and that is that in her eyes, nothing is ever her fault or her responsibility. Is this just common prepubescent behavior or an ADHD thing? There's a couple of examples. Do you want examples? She just finished teasing her younger sister. Her sister is loudly telling her, or telling me that what her older sister has done from across the house, and then my 11-year-old retaliates by pushing her sister to the ground. I arrive on the scene to say that hurting her younger sister is not acceptable. She starts blaming her sister for telling on her and blaming me for giving her a hard time about pushing her sister. So there's an example of it not being her fault.
Yeah, so as I hear this, there's two, what I would say, common behaviors of childhood. One is sibling fighting. We've done lots of shows over sibling fighting. And what's the utility of fighting with your sibling? And a lot of it is to get parental engagement or to keep you locked into a role in the family.
Right.
But if the mom puts this through the filter, this is why I worry about labels and understanding of the diagnosis. If you put it through the label, well, my child has a attention deficit disorder, she can't pick up on things, she's unable to learn. Well, in fact, she has learned. She's learned that if I bug my sister, I get parental involvement and engagement, and there's a utility to it. And that saying it over and over and over again doesn't mean she's got some incapacity to understand what I'm telling her because she does it again and again. In fact, there's a different explanation for why she continues on the behavior, not inability because of brain dysfunction, but because it serves a purpose for her. So I don't want kids to get these alibis that they're not accountable for their behavior, or that they can't do it because they've got attention deficit disorder. What I would say is you parent exactly the same, and you have them begin to exercise, I better pay attention because I don't get a second chance, or I better get ready on time because otherwise I miss the bus. But if you say, I got to drive him to school, he always misses the bus, he's got attention deficit disorder, he's like, why would I get on the bus? I get a ride if I don't. And then they don't work, they don't exercise that part of their brain, their experience, but they can learn. They can absolutely learn.
Right, and she is learning. She's by that example.
Well, that's the point. They're learning something every day,
right? And
they're learning that you will accommodate and and that they don't need to be responsible because you're going to give them the alibi that it's on their ADHD. It's not on them.
Right.
Yeah.
Another question, my son has recently been put on meds for his ADHD and it seems to be helping, but now he is having issues with sleeping and eating. Apparently this is common. There are drugs to help with this too, but that just seems like too many medications for a little guy. I'm really struggling with this decision. It doesn't say how old he is.
Yeah. And again, my designation and my expertise is as a parenting expert and as a family counselor.
Right.
So I am not a doctor, I am not a psychiatrist, but I would say my general rule to people when they're trying to make an important decision about this with their kids is speak to a generalist and speak to somebody who is specific. Because you know the expression, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. So I have great respect for people that are in psychiatry, but I think the general public doesn't understand that if you go back through the history, that there was at one of the annual general meetings, just as psychotherapy was starting to become a more popular science, there was a decision that there was an overlap in the professions and that psychiatry was going to stop trying to be psychotherapy and that it was specifically going to be about a pharmacological intervention with brain-based issues. So if you go to a psychotherapist, they're going to give you that answer. That's what they're trained to do. They're in a sense biased in that direction because that's what they're training. That the decisions tree they go through is how do we get you on the right meds. So some know talk therapy, but they'd probably be really old. Whereas in psychotherapy, get training in how medicines interact or whatever. We look at things like private logic, mistaken beliefs, and patterns of interactions in relationships, more holistic things like that. And so you're going to get a very different perspective on that. So I would say go to your generalist, go to your specialist, ask some other parents, trust yourself, your spidey senses, as a parent, and weigh those things and look and see and try and see if it's going to work. There's certainly lots of people who have worked with kids that have become, because each drug then interacts with something else, and it does tend to be you start with one and next thing you know your kid's on 4 or 5. That's very common.
Right.
And there are people that will work with families to get them off all of them because they just get fed up. There's just too many side effects. And the brain is still developing. I mean, that's probably one of my biggest concerns, is that the brain is growing until 25. And these drug interactions, that's worrisome to me. So if we can do without, I'm always going to err on the side of do without. And so maybe by learning about some of these other interventions that are much more around some of the parent training, developing the social interest, more consequenting, getting more of that in place, he might be able to function even without the ADHD or the Adderall.
That's why I've always loved this show, because, one of the reasons that I became involved in the first place is the idea of feeling like I'm not alone. As a parent with 2 young kids, being able to sit down and watch and know that other people are experiencing these problems. And it's difficult when you have something like a diagnosis, because perception and stigma around you are sometimes one of your worst enemies when you're trying to make these decisions.
And we feel a lot, we put a lot on ourselves, but an incredible amount of pressure on ourselves that anything that's happening with our kids and their kids' behavior, we think if we were better at parenting, that they wouldn't be displaying these things. And so we get really down and we get incredibly judgmental. But we're specifically talking about ADHD just because there is such a high prevalence rate now. And again, if you just want to talk about the politics of it, there's some countries like France, there's hardly any attention deficit disorder. Now, is that cultural, or is that they have a different lens on why kids do that? Is it because they do different parenting in the early years? We see in the United States that there are pockets where there's whole states and belts where we see more diagnoses again. It doesn't really make sense if it's just part of the human condition that we would see these patterns such as this. But I want to loop back and say it could be any one of kids who have issues that we need to attend to. And I just finished writing my first published journal article in the Journal of Individual Psychology about working with kids with severe disabilities. So not the attention deficit disorder, but as severe as like nonverbal, feeding tubes, spasticity, blindness, And what's interesting is that all the Adlerian principles that I talk about in terms of guiding the child, those all work with kids in those special needs as well. So it's not like saying, oh, well, your Adlerian stuff doesn't work for my kid because he's got ADHD. No. The good principles of parenting hold across all children. All children. Yeah.
Very good. Another question, how do you adjust your parenting style with a child with ADHD? And that speaks with what you're talking about. My son is 10 years old and received his diagnosis almost 2 years ago. He's not on medication, since we found that with reminders from us and teachers, he can manage and still do well in school. How do we parent and give consequences when we know that many of his behaviors are caused by the ADHD? Forgetting to do what was asked, bugging his sisters, moving slowly. That's describes a lot of kids, and that goes back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Right?
So I don't want, this is the difference between ADHD causes behavior versus behavior has a positive benefit.
Right.
And so I don't want it to be that he gets this alibi and isn't held accountable. And so I would say you don't need to make accommodations in that way. I would say the kind of accommodations I might make is the same as I would make somebody who didn't make meet the criteria. So for example, time, keeping track of time. That's hard. we don't come onto the planet knowing how to keep track of time. Teaching time management is something that some kids have to learn. Some kids are better at it than others. Some people it's more natural. Some kids are more defiant about that. But if you don't teach it, it's never going to be learned. So it's fair to say everyone's on a different trajectory of how well they're learning it. Some kids are going to learn it by grade 2. Some kids are going to learn it in their first year university. I don't know where your kid is on that trajectory, but we still are on the same path of trying to teach it. So I don't want your time management method to be when mommy yells. I don't want your time management method to be when mom reminds or gets upset enough. That's not a good training. So but if somebody has trouble mapping it on their own, I might say, I'm unwilling to remind you, but what are some things that you could do so that when you're on your own without me as a support system, when you're off at university or college or living on your own, how will you remember to keep track of time? Do you want to set an alarm? Do you want to put it on your watch? Do you want to put stickies on the door that says, remember knapsack? I want to help them create their own system that does not use me as a codependent to take over that responsibility. That's not setting them up for independence down the road. So I think you work with them. And if the consequence for bugging you don't bug your sister because you have ADHD. And like I said, there's other dynamics that explain sibling rivalry.
It's just a rite of passage.
So you discipline them. You discipline them just the same way you would anybody else, and just forget about the diagnosis. Just get on with your parenting.
You mentioned going away to university. How is it best to foster independence in your son for when they go away to post-secondary school, particularly when the child has Asperger's?
Asperger's, yeah. So we're talking about a different diagnosis. So autism has a spectrum, and again, you get kids with autism that are really they can be nonverbal, really living in a different mindset, really not connecting with humans at all. All the way through to people with Asperger's who are very high functioning, probably do well at school, whatever, have some social skills deficits in terms of how they connect. And a lot of people you might not even know have Asperger's. You know, it can be that inconsequential in terms of how they're doing. So again, I would what her questions about how to make sure for university, sorry?
Just foster independence for going away to university.
Yeah. So again, the Asperger's diagnosis is about social connection. It's not about whether or not you can do your laundry. Just see what I'm saying? Like, it sucks to be you. You have trouble socially connecting and you have to do laundry. So I would just, again, have a higher expectation for them. Stop thinking about how this Asperger's is getting in the way of things. Hold them accountable and train them for all those things just like anybody else. And anywhere where they need to be shored up, start working on that now, or start teaching them how they can self-monitor on their own. But a lot of these kids get very coddled. They get pampered, they get pitied because they're seen as being deficient, and therefore the training is in lag time. So I would just say, you don't want to throw your kid into the deep end with no water wings on. I'm just saying you got a year of catch up to do if they haven't learned to be independent, but they can be if you train them and step out.
See, you make this sound so not easy, but you explain it in a way that people understand. And when you deal with a diagnosis, often you read information and it's above your head. It's above anything that you understand. So when you're talking about Asperger's and, you know, that social connectivity and relating it to laundry, that makes sense to people. But it's hard for them to read a diagnosis, read in the information, and then extend it into everyday life.
Well, you know, I hope that when they hear the information that we're sharing, that it's optimistic, that it shows faith in parents, it shows faith in children, that it's more holistic, so that we look at the whole child, we look at the whole family, we look at all of society. So that's why kind of my tagline on my website, principle, rules, and tools. Sometimes when you have the principle, it might not look pretty every day. You know, it might not, you know, it might be harder to pull off than to say it. I get that. It's like, there's an expression, it's easier to fight for your principles than live by them. Oh, I can fight for my principles, but at least it means that we can course correct and be gentle with ourselves and say, like, you know, well, It's hard to watch his laundry builder. I don't want him to go to school with jam all over his shirt because he already has social issues, and now maybe he's going to get picked on and bullied, and that's going to create all these other problems. It's hard. Like, everything I'm saying is hard. But if we have just sort of some guiding principles to come back to, it gives us some equanimity that we're on the right path. And I think for a lot of parents, it's about confidence. You know, it's about, am I doing the right thing? Different people say different things. I think if you have one kind of framework that's positive and it's helpful and useful, that just frames everything else, I think it sort of helps us keep plodding along.
Yes.
Plodding along.
I did have an aha moment, and we just have a couple minutes left, but I had an aha moment as you talked in this half an hour. You know, I have 2 or 3 friends who have said when they've looked at a diagnosis and looked at the list like you had and went, I have a lot of that. Maybe I, 20, 30 years ago in school, I should have been diagnosed when there wasn't
they were.
diagnosis.
You know what they were diagnosed with? Ants in the pants.
Yeah.
That's what we used to call it. Hey, Billy's got ants in his pants.
But then on
ADHD.
But then on the flip side, they're not looking at the fact, they're thinking, well, maybe I have the diagnosis too, instead of maybe my child, maybe the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and they have the same type of attention and just not able to sit, and all of those simple diagnosis criteria that a parent has.
I meet the criteria for adult attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and I love it.
Yeah.
I get so much done. I'm here, I'm there, do the parenting show, go off to a workshop. Love it. Wouldn't want to be any other way, And so I think, again, for parents, like, we love and embrace all the varieties of human beings that land on planet Earth, and all we do is we need to ask ourselves to use our qualities for the betterment of mankind, and that those characteristics that we have should be more growth enhancing than inhibiting. It's only when it impairs functioning that we need to start getting busy with thinking about how things might be different in the family.
Right.
And so, kids got to go to school. We've got to get a basic education. We've got to be in relationships. We need to give back to mankind. But, just keep it high level, people. Love all the varieties of humans that come into our world.
I love ending on that note. With 30 seconds left, I just want to share some resources. Obviously, Alyson's books are available, 3 books available everywhere, but on your website as well for more information. You can check out Alyson's website, and there's links to newsletter and blogs and information.
I have a whole resource page too for teachers.
Resource page.
Things for Dr. Frank Walton writes a lot about attention deficit disorder from an Adlerian perspective. If people really want to deep dive into it, check my resource page.
Perfect. And of course, RogersTV.com for more information about the parenting show. On behalf of Alyson and myself and everyone here, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.